year after his revival of Beanie and Cecil ended, John worked a few more odd jobs with Hanna-Barbera before deciding to establish a studio with Bob Kemp, Lynn Naylor, and Jim Smith. Chris Vellucci had reconnected with an old friend on Beanie, animation producer Carl Masek, the man who helped bring anime to North America, and he took on the tasks of finding John and his friends a studio space and any animation gigs, while Naylor was a layout artist for various other studios, and Camp and Smith worked on Tiny Toons. It was tough going that year when they shopped around shows like G.I. Babies and the Ripping Friends. We'll get to that one later, but nobody took them then. After more of their projects went nowhere, John decided to step back into the animation industry, and what he would create would become the show that defines the studio and John's legacy. And there's a reason why I decided to do this in August. This month marks the 30-year anniversary of the Ren and Stimpy Show. The show about the gross and demented exploits of a chihuahua and a cat. That same year, the then young TV network, Nickelodeon, at that point in time were a rerun factory, were dipping their toes into original animated content that respects children when they made 2 animated specials. Producer Vanessa Coffey scheduled meetings with several independent animators to hear their ideas. John needed to get a meeting with her, and Masek begged her to give him a chance. She gave them the last slot before she went back to New York, and Spumco went all out for this meeting, putting together quite a presentation for them. The shows pitched to Coffey were He Hog the Atomic Pig, Jimmy's Clubhouse, starring Jimmy the Idiot Boy, The Predator, and Your Gang. Chris Vellucci's performance during the meeting convinced her to get his work on TV. They even impressed the Nickelodeon executives. They loved Jimmy's Clubhouse but didn't care much for the others. They already picked up Rugrats from Klasky Csupo, so they didn't need Your Gang, but Coffey did like 2 characters who'd later be known as Ren and Stimpy, and asked John to develop a show centered around them. John was not prepared to hand over the rights to what he felt like were his best creations to a network like Nickelodeon if one of them was greenlit. When they wouldn't budge on letting him keep his creations, he decided to keep Jimmy's Clubhouse and let them have Ren and Stimpy. I'm actually interested to see what Jimmy's Clubhouse would have been like. At the tail end of 1989, they started production on the pilot, Big House Blues. It focuses on Ren and Stimpy looking for food and shelter. They eventually get picked up by a dog catcher and are taken to the pound. They have a good time until one of them is led to be put down. Ren starts freaking out about this and tries to think of a way out. This 8-minute short cost him $80,000 to make, with a relatively small team animating it. In comparison to the first episode of the show, this short's animation is incredible. There are plenty of sequences where it's shown to be theatrical fluid. I could only notice maybe one animated segment that didn't look good. It also contains a couple of the visual tropes the show is known for. The short has tons of visual jokes, whether it's our pals uniting in the face of adversity, their bellies getting chewed on by old man hunger, or their bodies distorting all over the place. And a handful of ironic statements like Ren chastising Stimpy for not having a sense of hygiene after he drank out of the toilet, and the narrator telling us he's been known to lie before proceeding with the following true story. Nice stuff. I imagine it had remained in its unedited form when it made the rounds at film festivals to promote the show, because when it aired on Nick TV in the show's first season, a few parts were cut out. The dog catcher shaking his butt when saying, "See if I care," after giving them party hats, and a sleeping Ren kissing Stimpy, freaking out and then drinking out of a toilet were removed, despite the latter being included in the show's intro. The show overall is divided into 2 eras. The Spumco Era, which covers the first 2 seasons, and the Games Era for the other 3. I'll talk about the show during this time, then get into some behind-the-scenes stuff before moving on. Spumco pride themselves on making their cartoons look good, even if the story and jokes are weak. The backgrounds in Ren and Stimpy, depending on what genre they're doing and location, are done well. The suburbs and cities, mostly, are depicted as they were from a storybook, or from an early Hanna-Barbera cartoon. They're simple and help make the show come off as something for kids, and they're appealing. On the off occasion, they go for other background types to match the mood of the story. In Son of Stimpy, they come off as more realistic for the dramatic story of Stimpy looking for his fragrant offspring. A visual hallmark of the show is its paint drop backgrounds. The normal ones would drop out for color cards with blotches on them. These are used to help emphasize a character's emotions when they're excited, angry, or slipping into insanity. When Ren and Stimpy are put into a fantasy setting, they get it down okay, but their imagination is let loose on the science fiction episodes. Gaze at all of these. The show didn't have model sheets the artists had to adhere to, as John encouraged them to never use the same facial expression for them twice. This resulted in Ren and Stimpy having unique expressions of emotions we knew. Another thing he insisted on is that the storyboards would never be toned down in layouts. So we got several different interpretations of Ren and Stimpy by people like Bob Camp, Vincent Waller, Jim Smith, and Chris Riccardi. Pay close attention to how they are drawn and you'll recognize whose character stylings are who. How they are animated fluctuates from episode to episode. They've used various studios of varying skill to work on them, so the work they turn in will be bound to have some mistakes from the lesser quality studios. There would be painting errors. The turtle shell in Untamed World was painted white in one shot when it was green in every other. Camera errors were present in Nurse Stimpy as Ren took off his fur, and Untamed World during Ren and the Yak's chase. And character animation errors, like the layers being visible on Ren in Stimpy's Big Day, and Stimpy still moving when he's supposed to have stopped in Nurse Stimpy. Apart from those instances, Season 1 appears to be animated more smoothly underneath its graininess. When Season 2 began, the graininess was taken out. A good chunk of the work had moved over to a new animation studio called Rough Draft Korea. That's right, the studio that is used on a lot of shows got its start on Ren and Stimpy. Established by Greg Vanzo in 1991, he animated footage of fire dogs in his garage. He showed it to John, hoping to get work on the show. John was nervous about presenting this idea to Nickelodeon, but they agreed to let Greg set it up in Korea and for John to use them on Ren and Stimpy. These guys produced the second best looking episodes of Season 2. Now the studio to crank out the best animated episodes is Carbuncle Cartoons. When you look at Son of Stimpy, Sven Hoek, Man's Best Friend, and the Royal Canadian Kilted Yaxman, it is amazing how smooth they are. This is the stuff you find in animated movies. I'm amazed this was made for television. The show's title characters starred in Big House Blues, but we didn't get a good grasp on their personalities in the short. So let's get into them as they are in the show. Ren Hoek is a skinny asthma hound chihuahua with a short fuse. John had noticed a photo by Elliot Irwit of a chihuahua in a sweater that he found to be really funny. He drew him several times during college and would do an impression of Peter Lorre, saying things like, "I am here to murder your baby." Ren on the show is, at his base, the one who thinks of himself as looking out for Stimpy, the one who thinks of the schemes for them to get food and shelter, the one who carries himself like someone who knows his way through the world until something comes along to flip it over. The characters in the show, when they went nuts, it wasn't the classic goofy kind of nuts. It was like they have legitimate mental problems. Ren, when he gets angry, it's intense and entertaining. Whether he was having an outburst,
Shut up! He's had this coming for a long time now!
or retaining himself when threatening people.
I'm gonna hit you, and you're gonna fall. And I'm gonna look down, and I'm gonna laugh.
That freak out and fake dad is my favorite one. Sometimes he'd be pushed so far that he'd become paranoid and start going on nonsensical ramblings. One of them including quotes from the Kirk Douglas film Champion.
Didn't you hear him? Didn't you see the crowd?
Cruz Falucci has taken on the role of Mr. Hoek during this era. He was able to project Ren's varying states incredibly well and have it come off as natural. His best friend, Stimpy, is a red-haired, blue-nosed, dumb cat. His design was inspired by the cats from the Bob Clampett cartoons Birdie and the Beast and Gruesome Twosome, and Billy West does his impression of Larry Fine for him. As he directed him, John told him to start from Larry to sound like a man whenever it sounded like he was drifting away. His push for perfectionism on the show made him push West to make him deliver his best performances. John had pushed himself, Billy West and others, to being hoarse until they got a great one. Michael Pataki, the man behind George Liquor, was reported to have a beet red face and sweating after his recording sessions. Stimpy's voice was one that had been a refreshing change from the "which way did he go, George?" type of dumb character voice. It contrasted well against his childish personality in a classically funny way. Because he often acts foolishly, he makes Ren flip out at him and smack him several times while calling him names. After Ren gets his thoughts on the world flipped over, Stimpy doesn't see this change and ends up believing the fake scenario they're in is real.
I'm not your dad. I'm only your fake dad. And only for this weekend.
Be nice to the product of your loins.
My fake loins.
When Ren gets his hands on him, he smacks him for his stupidity. In his obliviousness to Ren's obvious suffering, or the extent of it in episodes like Stimpy's Fan Club, he'd give his pal little things to help him feel better, like write him a fan letter or looking after him when he's sick. Ren and Stimpy in this era were a roller coaster of entertaining emotions in a duo. The show takes on the format of Golden Age cartoons. They're placed in whatever scenario, time period, and roles while retaining their personalities for the episode's story to play out. Out of the variety of stories, I was able to find 3 recurring ones. One where they're homeless and are looking for food and shelter. In these, Ren is the one who comes up with a scheme to get him and Stimpy those things. They'll succeed at it for a while until it somehow finally backfires. The Boy Who Cried Rat, Fire Dogs, Big Baby Scam, and Monkey See, Monkey Don't tell this type of story. Stimpy's storybook is where he reads a classic fairy tale in his own random way because he can't really read them. The approach was present in Ren Hoek to hilarious effect, but it fell by the wayside in The Littlest Giant. And finally, there is Commander Hoek and Cadet Stimpy, a trilogy of adventures throughout the universe. They all end with them meeting their demise. Throughout the series, you'll come across a few types of humor. The first is slapstick. Their approach is, at its best, you can see it coming, but they do all they can to make it painful and at times satisfying. For moments in season 1, though, it looked off, like with this moment in The Boy Who Cried Rat.
Yow! You're murdering me.
That doesn't look good. Next is the element that would define Ren and Stimpy, Spumco, and Nickelodeon. Gross out. Every bodily function you can think of, those hideously detailed close-ups, and fixating on butts. Oh, joy! And the big expressions getting pushed even further, like the eyes bugging out and freaking out after someone's skin melts off. Strange enough, this era of the show is the least gross, at least in comparison to what we'll get later. I'm confused over why Nick would complain about stuff like that. And lastly, innuendos. Like they would call boogers magic nose goblins and dog poop lawn cigars. Ren and Stimpy are shown as best pals a lot of times, but there are times where their relationship becomes romantic. Them sleeping in the same bed, Ren implying they should kiss underneath the mistletoe. That scene was censored initially, but they let it air as is because someone was sad by it. Sometimes there would be unintentional ones. The rubber nipples in Rubber Nipple Salesman was a change from just nipple. I'm imagining the lines as intended for the episode. Would you like to take a look at some fine nipples? You look like someone who could really use some nipples. Now, dear, don't you go buy new nipples when you don't use the ones you already have. I bet you thought nipples were just to put in your mouth. It's childish, but I'm grinning at it. They made them add the word rubber in front of nipple, but they inadvertently allowed the crew to refer to them as condoms. Coming back to the Commander Hoek and Stimpy episodes and how they ended, they do so in various ways. There will be nice ones where Ren and Stimpy have achieved their goal, they're reunited, or Stimpy is allowing Ren to cry in his embrace or get rewarded for doing a good job. Bad endings like they get punished for their schemes falling through and Ren scolding Stimpy for his idiocy, like allowing a beaver into his own clean water supply. Then there are ones that leave you confused, like it would stop at a point before getting to anything resembling the real ending, like Ren smacking Stimpy with the space guide surrounded by killer bacteria, but they don't do anything to them, or Ren getting beaten up by two nude babies in front of a cop, their nude father, and Stimpy who just watches.
1, 2, let me go. 5, 6, that's enough.
Or just getting kicked out of a client's house and ride off on bulls a la the Three Stooges.
Now get out.
The last way the endings would be puzzling would be in an anticlimactic way, like Ren and Stimpy would show up as different animals after pretending to be monkeys for 11 minutes. However they end, you'll end up remembering them. During these escapades, they would come across several interesting characters, like Mr. Horse, a talking horse who most often speaks in a deadpan tone when in conversation. His catchphrase is, "No sir, I don't like it." John has voiced him during this era and when Ren and Stimpy was revived. Billy West took over the duties for the rare occasions he's on screen. Muddy Mudskipper is a skipping fish and host of his own show that Stimpy frequently watches. When we first meet him, he's giving him advice on how to make it as an actor in Hollywood, sprinkled in with a few jokes. He always ends his sentences with, "You lousy bum," even when he's being nice earlier. The fire chief commonly wields a weapon to strike at what he thinks are circus midgets. You'll find out why later. This will be a common thing with him, and much of his character is modeled after Ralph Bakshi. The salesman was first introduced as a narrator in Space Madness, the one who hilariously egged on Stimpy to push the history eraser button.
At the mere push of a single button!
He's also the finals judge from Dog Show, and he would make a few more appearances in the games era where he'd become a salesman. This man has an upbeat tone to his voice that contrasts with his forceful actions and occasional insults. Mr. and Mrs. Pipe are a married couple from the 1950s. Mr. Pipe always wears a bathrobe wherever he goes. Their faces aren't shown and they partake in very strange activities, like taking baths with their children and the grandfather, making their kids walk on hot coals when teaching them to walk. The wife has a massive pile of hair, I don't know if it was on her head or from her body, and the husband makes her get mauled by their pet baboon. Powdered Toast Man is a superhero and spokesman for the breakfast product, Powdered Toast. He's a tall, muscular man with toast slices for a head. Whenever he goes to protect people, he often hurts them unintentionally, like stopping a truck from running over a cat by crashing a plane into it, or leaving the Pope on a mountain to tend to the president's wardrobe issue. He goes by the secret identity of Pastor Toastman, a minister who works as a government clerk. The only one who knows what he really does is his Catholic schoolgirl assistant. Abner and Ewald are two incredibly slow-witted cowboys who love hanging people. And I really mean slow-witted with all these moments of them staring out into space before the situation dawns on them. The worst stupid character you can think of are more enjoyable than these two. And Victor is a neighborhood kid who first picks on Ren and Stimpy while hanging out with a kid named Anthony. He comes in, beats them all up, and runs off with his dad while smoking cigars. He's a basic bully character and only appears in 3 episodes in the series. These characters are strange in different ways, and some will be remembered more than others. When they ran short of their runtime, they fill in that extra time with bumpers advertising fake products. John wanted to make them around real products from real sponsors as a way to fund the show. This idea was shot down as the FCC had stricter guidelines when advertising to children. He still went through with them, instead making up a bunch of fake products. The new goal was now to satirize the idea that companies can sell anything. Log toys with an amusing jingle, powdered toast in a can, sugar-frosted milk, gritty kitty litter, and sugar sod pops are products seen in this era. In the case of this show, the satire was lost on the kids who saw them and they ended up wanting the fake products. Those weren't the only segments they produced, as there were ones like Ask Dr. Stupid, where Stimpy gives questions absurd answers, Ren and Stimpy saying goodbye to the audience and Stimpy getting emotional over when the next episode will be and Ren making him feel better, them introducing the audience to their secret headquarters and inducting them into the club before showing the next episode, bits like Ren and Mr. Horse at a UN conference and Stimpy setting up for Yak Shaving Day all work out decently. It's time to show everyone all the censoring that happened during this era, whether it was for broadcast or on the DVD set. The first season remained untouched by the censors when production on those episodes finished and on the DVD, but season 2 has been censored quite a bit. Apparently Ren and Stimpy's physical was edited down for In the Army's airing on Spike TV years later. I don't think that matters that much, and I don't know what parts were cut out. And I don't think I'll ever know. The cross on the Pope's hat was removed and his name was changed to the Man with the Pointy Hat in Powdered Toast Man, and the scene where Powdered Toast Man uses the Constitution and Bill of Rights to restart a fire was cut from broadcast, but you can watch it on the DVD set. A moment where Stimpy spits into a jar and Ren's toothache was removed on the English DVD set, and Ren grinding his teeth into dust looked to be cut down. The jar spit moment was put back in on the German DVD set. Abner and Ewalt putting nooses around their necks and Ewalt's final line, "Y'all bring the kids next time, you hear?" and Out West were removed from broadcast and on DVD. The scene of Sven and Stimpy playing circus with a litter box in a closet and Sven Hoek was edited out in the episode's airings, and Ren saying he'd gouge out their eyes had been removed from broadcast but was put back in on the DVD. But the clip is noticeably lower quality, there's different music, and the timer is visible. The line is a reference to infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. The ghost trying to scare Ren and Stimpy with a bloody head backfiring when the bloody head fairy shows up is removed from the DVD set. A portion of Mr. Pipe hugging Ren and Big Baby Scam was cut out on the DVD. Old Man Hunger whistling a tune to Ren and Stimpy was removed as well. Fun fact about that moment, the tune he whistles is Hall of the Mountain King, and it supposedly implies pederasty. Dog Show was mutilated when it aired as they removed George's last name and any mention of him, and airbrushed out his hemorrhoid at the end during broadcast. It's all restored on the DVD. Re-airings of Son of Stimpy and the VHS release removed Stimpy talking to the cop. The version that aired on Spike TV cut out Stimpy laying awake unable to sleep. A sequence that adds a lot to the episode. And Ren putting Stimpy's Christmas present next to his photo. All of this is uncut on the German DVD set. Only a close-up of Ren lighting a match has been removed from the DVD version of The Great Outdoors. The assembly line montage has been shortened on the DVD set for The Cat That Laid the Golden Hairball, but it's visible on the German set. Occasional reruns of Stimpy's Fan Club removed Ren turning into an ass. The word hell was censored on the Nickelodeon broadcast of the Royal Canadian Kilted Yaxman and on the English DVD set, but it's uncensored on a rebroadcasting on MTV. The relationship Nickelodeon has with Ren and Stimpy is a complicated one, and it began when the pilot was just passable. It was a show Nickelodeon were fearful of because of how gross, vulgar, and strange it is. But at the same time, kids laughed the most at its pilot. That attitude was shown when they only ordered 6 half hours compared to Rugrats and Doug getting 13 half hours. It continued when Spumco got to work on their first season in 1990. They frequently had trouble getting their outlines and storyboards approved by Nick, delaying production until March of the following year. They insisted on having the final say with what could be shown in the episodes. John had a philosophy about writing for cartoons. If you couldn't draw, you don't write. And this philosophy translated into hostility towards Nickelodeon staff who were supervising them during the process, like May Harrington and Mitchell Kriegman. They had great respect for John and for what Spumco did, but that didn't matter to him. Kriegman was often singled out as a target for Crisfolucci's resentment. He found that really funny because he respected him as an artist, but he hated him because he was simply doing his job. While Kriegman loved what they did, Camp thought he had a very patronizing view of what children can understand. He and John told him the format for Ren and Stimpy was like Rocky and Bullwinkle. Kriegman said kids wouldn't be able to follow along with a show like that. The Nick execs had a hard time understanding the written premises of the show that John had to fly out from Los Angeles to New York to explain them. They would get it, but when Spumco would board them, they'd notice some questionable stuff in them. John thought their lack of understanding of animation's fundamentals were the cause of these back and forths. Sometimes they don't understand the show's humor and wanted John to break the unspoken rule of comedy. Explain the joke. He just replied with, "That's the joke," but they were dead set on him explaining it to them. Christine Danzo, a producer on the show, said that everyone's goal was to make it funny and acceptable. Spumco had a penchant for adult humor, gross-out jokes, and references to obscure things that Nickelodeon didn't understand nor find funny. When they told him to cut some of the stuff out, John went to Vanessa to try and get her to help him out, telling her and the other execs that they're trying to take Christmas away from kids. Coffee told him not to hold back with what he did, leaving her to do that herself. Kriegman blamed this arrangement for Spumco's hostile attitude towards them. Finally, Nick said they can go as far as they want, as long as they don't make something they can't air. Kriegman was eventually replaced as story editor by Will McRobb, with no hard feelings about the whole affair. Countless times, Nick and Spumco had said that the show was for children, despite there being content unsuitable for them. John oversaw the layout process that Vanessa Coffey signed off on. He gave the artists the storyboards to work from, sometimes giving them additional drawings he just drew for guidance. When they finished their first drafts, he'd go over them, call for changes, and send them back for corrections. They'd make them and bring them back to him for it to start again. This would happen 3 or 4 times before he'd approve them for the next stage. The quota for layouts was 15 scenes per week. Each scene comprised of 10 layout drawings, and John was going over each and every one of them, calling for there to be changes. Some have said that this approach to them was aggressive to the point of being combative. To those who worked there, Spumco became a school. The artists would learn a lot while on the job and would feel terrible at the realization of how bad they are. Jim Gomez recalled John had started a coloring book club as a child where his members had to do the books exactly how he did them. I imagine since his father made him feel powerless as a kid, he wants to have control over something in his life, and that club was it at that age. And this was something he nurtured and got good at by the time the show began. A lot of industry professionals have called this approach insane, but Ren and Stimpy have benefited visually from John's attentiveness. But when deadlines loomed and was confronted by people wondering when the work will be completed, he said rushing it would mean poor quality. He'd send out a memo telling the layout artists to do fewer drawings so they can get back on schedule. Nickelodeon became fearful that the studio might be unable to deliver the episodes on time. Since meeting face to face with him accomplished nothing, they went behind his back to try and get someone on the inside to report to them Spumco's operations, hoping to temper what they thought was John's behavior. David, I'll just put the rest on screen, was enlisted to do that task, but gave up a week in when he realized the studio had captured lightning in a bottle. When the Nicktoons block finally aired on August 11th, 1991, only Stimpy's Big Day was ready. The following week, they had to rerun that episode. By that month, half the episodes weren't animated. They were supposed to deliver 1 episode a week over a 6-week period. Nick silently acknowledged their role in delaying the show and recognized that Ren and Stimpy was different from Rugrats and Doug. Both parties agreed to change the deal to once a fortnight over a 12-week period. Nick had told the less than happy advertisers about the new deal. Even with the deadlines extended, Spumco couldn't deliver in a timely fashion. All of the episodes had been delivered, though except for Stimpy's Invention. It had been in production for so long that Nick deemed it the lost episode of the season. The episode in question has Stimpy put together a helmet to make Ren happy when he sees him struggling to get free from socks he made, but he ends up torturing him further. The episodes that came before this had quite a few mistakes. The studios Spumco were working with often bungled what they had sent to them, so John paid special attention to the animation this time around. When it got shipped out with Black Hole, an overseas supervisor named Howard Baker had quit. John asked Bob Jakes of Carbuncle Cartoons to take up the job in the Philippines. He said he had enough of working in Asia, but when he saw what Phil Cartoons had did to Fire Dogs, he accepted. When he saw what footage they had done for Stimpy's Invention, they reportedly looked terrible. He had no choice but to use the original pencil test to save it. In one instance, he noticed a 3-frame camera move had been changed to an 11-frame one. He asked the checker why they did this and said that a 3-frame camera move was impossible. Jakes was able to do what many thought to be impossible: overhaul Phil Cartoons' production system to ensure the survival of artistry. He was able to save a good chunk of it there, and any mistakes they made while fixing it, he mended back in the States. Like with everything else in the show, Nickelodeon had a hard time approving it for production. The episode came off as less of a kids' cartoon and more of a live-action psychodrama. But John begged Vanessa to let him do it, like getting down on his knees begging. Ren's jaw coming off as he laughed. Vincent Waller remembered they thought it was too horrible to air. The sequence Ren being forced by the helmet to smile. Ren beating his hand with a rolled-up newspaper as they believed it to have a child abuse subtext. Stimpy using a duck as a soldering gun during the Invention building sequence. Waller had suggested replacing it with a woodpecker, but John simply said no to their request. While they did have the usual fights over content, Stimpy's Invention's problem was that John didn't want to send it out until everything about it was perfect, even going so far as to redraw all the layouts himself. A lot of the Spumco employees shared Coffey's opinion on the situation. John wanting the episode to be the hit of the season caused them to toss out the production schedule, as it took them a year to do. One part about it wasn't the episode's quality, but just John being indecisive about certain things, like the stay put socks gag. It was during this episode where there was a time he yelled at David, here's the name up here again, for accurately guessing what colors he'd make the Happy Helmet. These delays affected the overseas animation studios they were using. They were forced to make layoffs because there wasn't enough footage coming in to keep the animators busy. A scenario like this in commercial Hollywood goes the way of overindulging the artist, their work failing, and the studio would take over. That didn't happen for John. Nickelodeon had advertised Stimpy's Invention as the lost episode, and John predicted that it would be the hit of the season. He was right. Jakes worked really hard to make this look good, as the animation is smooth, even when they're pulling off the trickier sequences like Ren trying to escape those socks and the Happy Helmet. I noticed maybe a couple of ironic moments, if you consider Ren wanting to finish reading his paper one. Okay, I only found one. It was him saying stay put socks were a good idea even for people who don't wear clothes. The episode's slapstick is executed very well. The pretty normal bits like Ren throwing cheese into Stimpy's face and the image of an angry shaved Ren, to the more difficult moments like the stay put socks, and the ones Nickelodeon had a hard time understanding, like Stimpy using a duck to work on his Happy Helmet. When Ren tries to get out of the socks filled with glue, Stimpy sees that he's miserable but doesn't put together that he's causing his misery until he has him by his fat throat. Him using the Happy Helmet to force a smile onto Ren's face is disturbingly funny. You could pull from this episode the idea that some people who intend to help others but end up causing more harm than intended, sometimes they don't see that they're the problem. The ending sequence of Ren and Stimpy dancing to Happy Happy Joy Joy, great stuff. John wanted to get Burl Ives to do the song, but when he didn't call him back, he did his best impression of him for it. Seeing our boys dance to the title lyrics is a delight. Stinky Whizzleteats would slowly devolve into a deranged movie quote.
I told you I'd shoot, but you didn't believe me. Why didn't you believe me?
We still had some enjoyable lines in this song before that.
I'll teach your grandmother to suck eggs. A fly marrying a bumblebee.
Because the episodes were missing their original deadlines for delivery, hence Nick changing the deal, The ratings for the reruns initially fell behind Rugrats and Doug, but then word about how the show stood out from those two began to spread when the reruns continued. When it was aired on MTV for 6 weeks, the show's popularity exploded, to a point where 3,000 people lined up at the Golden Apple comic store in Vancouver for a signing in 1992, meeting several members of Spumco, including John, and it went from 2 p.m. to 9:30. The show could have solved its content issues if they were moved to MTV instead of Nickelodeon, but it was too big for them to give it up. It won't be the last time they feverishly held on to something. Its popularity attracted the attention of several celebrities. A few of them got to be on the show. Frank Zappa played the Pope in Powdered Toast Man, recording his lines on his deathbed from home. This wouldn't be the last time John directed someone with one foot in the grave. Randy Quaid was Anthony's father, who held a hatred for Ren and Stimpy in A Visit to Anthony. I think his performance was just a warm-up for how he'd live in the future. Rosie O'Donnell played a Girl Scout leader who tempts them to earn badges by doing dangerous activities in Season 3's Eat My Cookies. Dom DeLuise played an islander who talks like Marlon Brando, named the Big Kahuna in Season 4's Aloha Whack, where they lived in the carcass of a whale. Gilbert Gottfried voiced Jerry the Belly Button Elf in the Season 3 episode of the same name. He convinced Stimpy to hop inside his own belly button after playing with it for so long, and then he goes berserk and eats him and Ren when he's served lint loaf. While several notable people got on the show, not everyone who was interested got in, but for different reasons. Phil Spector was ready to star in an episode called Cellulettes, where Stimpy joins a girl band, playing a character named Ernie Volva. For some reason, this never became an episode. Maybe they shouldn't have named one of their characters after genitals. The one whose last name was Liquor had a tough time being on the show, and Robin Williams' agent called John to ask if he can do a voice on the show. John told him to call him fucking faggot. You folks now have another reason to hate him. You're welcome. When they were waiting for Stimpy's Invention's incredibly late arrival, they ordered a second season of 20 half-hour episodes. Once that deal was made, Christine Danzo left the production because she couldn't deal with John and Nickelodeon fighting. This deal meant that John had to hire more staff, so he bought up ad space in Comic Buyer's Guide, where applicants had to fax in their drawings of Ren and Stimpy to him, but only if they can draw them really well. And if you did, you were lucky to get a layout test and get hired. Being a Spumco employee involved working unpaid overtime, being paid under union scale, and beating yourself to draw better for John in the show. They added a few new people to their ranks. Peter Avanzino, Scott Wills, Stephen DeStefano, Richard Purcell, and Eleanor Blake. And soon they became defensive around anyone who would badmouth the show or where they worked. Sometimes John was able to bait them into accepting a job at his studio, like when they were working on the first season, a time where they also didn't hire many who were up to snuff. He convinced Teal Yang to be a color key supervisor. When he mentioned he's going to The Simpsons, John taunted him by calling that work safe and easy. This got Teal so angry, he accepted. Wang was impressed that John was able to figure him out in 2 minutes. The arguments over how the show should be presented continued. When Ren and Stimpy got critical praise and had attracted a new audience, Nick set out to be more careful with its content, as there are people paying attention to it, and if there is more questionable stuff in the show, they could get in trouble. This sometimes resulted in them asking for changes to the episodes after they had already approved of the outlines and storyboards. John had set out to make this season better than the last. He still continued to look over the layouts to the detriment of the schedule, but this resulted in some of the season's best acting in episodes like Son of Stimpy and Sven Hoek. But he thought he had to expand his control to other departments, like telling the very talented background painters how they should do them, mixing color palettes using examples he found in his collections of magazines and those old golden books. The most infamous moment regarding the backgrounds was when he blew up over Sven Hoek's. When he saw the ones for that episode, he screamed, "I'm tired of looking at Candy Cane Lane every day!" when he thought they looked like they were painted with candy cane colors. The painters responded by making a banner of Ren and Stimpy with candy canes shoved up their butts. They christened the department Candy Cane Lane. With the amount of episodes Season 2 originally called for, John had no choice but to offer other people the director's chair. Bob Camp, Vincent Waller, Jim Smith, and Chris Riccardi. With this new position, Camp established the studio's B unit so they can put out simple but funny cartoons, allowing John to spend more time on the show's hits. He treated the storyboards as layouts by drawing on layout-sized paper, cutting down on production time as they frequently fell behind schedule. Spumco soon went over their per-episode budget of $388,000 by $234,000. Nick had withheld more money until they gave them an updated budget and schedule. John tried to convince them that the extra money being spent were breakage costs, when they trimmed the season down from 20 to 13 episodes. Except even when they went down to 13, a lot of them didn't get past the outline stages, and that explanation didn't convince the network. So John's next solutions were offering to lengthen shorter episodes to a half hour, reviving the bumpers that apparently sucked, and sending out the episodes for layout instead of having them done at Spumco. He believed they would fall apart if they weren't done there. Nickelodeon saw right through John's scheme and approved his proposals for budget cutting. These new plans caused crew members to shelve other projects they were working on. If you've had a hard time keeping track so far, I'll recap. The problems surrounding the show at the time were Nickelodeon's constant censoring, whether it was because they didn't quite understand how the show worked starting out, or when it blew up they got more cautious of what could be shown because a demographic they didn't expect were watching and critics were paying attention. Spumco failed to deliver the episodes on time through a combination of John's perfectionism and Nickelodeon taking forever to approve them for production, and the studio went over budget. I understand that producing good animation is expensive, and this guy was raking up a higher bill for the network than they were comfortable with. These problems culminated with the first banned episode of the series, Man's Best Friend. In it, George Liquor, American, adopts Ren and Stimpy from the pet store and plans to mold them into champions with rigorous training. This involves making them poop on command, sit on his couch so he can shout at them, and have them attack him. The idea came from John and Jim Gomez's first trip to buy beer in LA. Jim noticed the name of the liquor store was George Liquor and remarked that it sounds like a good character. He had appeared in several pitches throughout the 1980s and in a handful of times in the first season, but Man's Best Friend was the first time his personality could shine. John and Chris Riccardi came up with the story while having lunch at a diner. As John was describing some of the stuff that would be in the episode, a nearby patron would get disgusted and cuss him out for it. This interaction would be the inspiration for the moment with the flies in Ren's toothache.
What are you trying to do? Make us puke?
George Liquor is a short, bug-eyed old man who, in this episode, believed that what he was doing was good, but he was blind to the abuse he was inflicting on Ren and Stimpy. Him screaming at them to get on his couch, giving Ren $40 and congratulations after beating him up were all great moments. If they did well in the program, he would reward them with rubber lawn cigars. On a technical level, it's a well-animated episode. By the looks of it, it's another one done by Carbuncle and there's barely an error. It cost Nickelodeon $500,000 to produce, and you can just see the money on the screen. Though they had approved the episode for production, Nick decided not to air it, citing its excessive violence and tobacco usage, when the following episodes were able to air with barely a problem. Out West has two cowboys hanging people, Big Baby Scam ends with two naked babies beating up Ren in front of their naked father and a cop. Rubber Nipple Salesman has Ren crushed by the fire chief with a shovel. Mad Dog Hoek sees Ren and Stimpy suffer tons of pain at the hands of Lump and Loaf. Ren wants to break Stimpy's neck in his sleep in Stimpy's fan club, and Kowalski smokes a whole pack of cigarettes in Fake Dad. Also, Coffee and the other executives hated George Liquor because they were uncomfortable with the idea of someone like him abusing the ones he's supposed to love, and weren't confident in Children's ability to pick up on the nuances of his character. His other appearance, Dog Show, which did make it to air, reportedly had pretty fierce conflicts over the content in it. The judge in the finals was supposed to be a skinny dude with a ponytail who George would call a panty waist, but he was replaced by the manlier narrator from Space Madness. There was supposed to be moments where he'd tell Stimpy to wink at the judge, and George would tell him to keep it professional, but those innuendos were too extreme for this show. As the conflict over this went on, John lost interest in the episode and had Chris Riccardi direct it, as he deemed it safe enough for him. As I mentioned before, because his last name is an alcohol reference, they had to censor it for broadcast. Man's Best Friend represented everything Nick hated about Ren and Stimpy and Spumco. Unwilling to compromise, it was delivered late, it cost them too much money, and they felt like they couldn't air it. John refused to cut anything out of the episode, so Nickelodeon got fed up, fired him, and removed Spumco from producing the show. Their decision to fire him was not an easy one to make, because John was painted by the press as the guiding force behind the show, and firing him would result in a PR nightmare. A little while before they made that choice, they met with him to discuss how to keep him on the show, but in a less involved position. One of their ideas was taking the bulk of the work to be done in another studio, leaving Spumco to do the A material. John rejected that, and they had no other choice. Various publications came to his defense. Fans of the show and major figures in the industry like Ralph Bakshi and Matt Groening came out to support him and expressed their disgust at what Nickelodeon had done. Taking almost all of the crew meant they had to establish a new studio. The future Nickelodeon Animation Studios was called Games Animation in August of 1992. The studio ID at the end of every half hour was Stimpy in a milkman outfit that was inspired by a comment John had made about handing over an unedited cartoon for them to finish it. What was missing was the bloody knife. Roy Smith and Jim Ballantyne had found the network an office building for it at $100,000. The relationship of everyone at the studio was akin to a family, so when John got fired, fallouts between them began. Nickelodeon saw the opportunity to entice the crew to still work on the show. They approached Bob Camp in secret to take it over. Working with John left him a bad taste, and with a family on the way to support, he took the job.
Scab!
John had at first encouraged everyone else to go to games, but later flipped out when they did, saying they weren't his friends.
Scab!
Billy West recalled John's outburst at him continuing with the show, demanding that he quit to get enough leverage to convince the network to let him stay. He decided to not get involved in the situation. The people who stayed with John were Jim Smith, Eleanor Blake, Vincent Waller, Mike Fontanelli, Eddie Fitzgerald, Libby Simon, and Richard Purcell. And they wrote a letter saying the crew won't work on Ren and Stimpy without John with their signatures on it. Fitzgerald thought that because the show has a particular style that's difficult to perfect, and the team was irreplaceable. The downside to them staying was he had no work for them and found themselves working on Deke's The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. When he was removed from the show, Nick continued to pay him sums of money for every half hour produced in his absence, and the rights to George Liquor had reverted back to him, which meant they couldn't make footage that would make Man's Best Friend airable. The network refused to discuss this with the press. Their radio silence on this matter allowed what was left of Spumco to drag them through the mud in various interviews. One of the articles said that Ren and Stimpy is dead and is now being handled by morons. Season 2 wasn't wholly finished when John got fired, so the remaining episodes were completed at Games. While the work was taken out of Spumco, John hurled at Roy Smith every insult he could think of. Roy gave him very classy parting words, but John wasn't a class act about it that he became critical of the episodes Spumco started that Games finished.
Go back to Chicago, you ugly hook-nosed sweet! Ow! Ow! And ow!
The animation quality for this era is more consistent. It's all pose to pose, but of a slightly lower standard than Spumco's averagely animated episode. One of the big changes in this era was that the majority of the episode's layouts were done at the satellite studios. John has considered them the last place where anyone can control the acting in cartoons. That's why he had paid very close attention to them to try and get the best versions of them from the artists. But in this period they were done overseas, where the artists there took the storyboards and blew them up. The people at the games did the characters in the boards in an awkward way and tried to cram as much detail into each scene. The characters don't have any dimension during this run, coming off as more detailed stick figures. The animation and art wasn't the only thing about the show that changed. Because John was fired, that meant Billy West took over voicing Ren for the remainder of the show. His take on the character was very shallow in comparison to John, and how he was written during this run blew up his jerky, selfish nature over every other facet of him. As with Stimpy, West got more high-pitched with him, drifting away from sounding like a man that made his childish personality funny. He, weird enough, was written the same during this run, and the episodes took on a mostly different approach from here on in. Outside of certain crew members who sacrificed their free time to make some of the games era's better episodes, Nickelodeon urged the crew to move away from making psychodramas and towards being a silly, gut-funny kind of show. These episodes were described as having a Mad Lib approach to how they're written. Pick a scenario and put in a few silly things to constitute jokes. It had been known that Nickelodeon had problems with Ren and Stimpy's content. While I didn't detect any hints to them being gay or jokes like the prison romance book, this era proved to be darker, more violent and gross than Spumco ever was. Stimpy's organs being shown after his skin is torn off, them being eaten by a worm that looks like Fred Flintstone, them being ripped apart by a vicious baboon, Stimpy feeding glasses of camel spit to Ren to help him sleep, and living inside a festering whale carcass that got worse underneath the hot sun, are sights you'll see in this era. Some have concluded that because this era produced more extreme content than what Spumco made, they suspected the real reason they fired John was because they found him difficult to deal with. What also doesn't help their case was while they banned Man's Best Friend for George Licker's overbearing presence on Ren and Stimpy, among other things, they produced several episodes featuring similar characters for them to react to instead of acting along. Circus midgets, who tortures them in between robbing petrol stations and destroying cop cars, and the old lady from It's a Dog Life, who adopts them and names them Abraham and Leviticus, and after suffering her weird behavior, they find out she has a pet cemetery in her backyard. They freak out and try to escape, but after she dies, they're taxidermied along with her in the mansion she left to the butler who murdered her in her sleep with a lead pipe. These kinds of episodes are uncomfortable and don't give us a satisfying payoff, unlike Man's Best Friend. Other reoccurring characters that show up in this period are Wilbur Cobb, the godfather of animation in this show, and is built up to be that in Stimpy's cartoon show. Then when Ren and Stimpy present the cartoon Stimpy Slaved Over, we see he's a doddering old fool who rambles nonsensically. He's used very well in this episode, but is shoehorned into a few other to diminishing results because Camp wanted to give Jack Carter some work. Haggis McHaggis is a Scotsman, in case the name repeating the word haggis was too subtle a clue, who once had a TV show where he beat his dog with a shillelagh. When it got cancelled, he lost his house and was on the street. When he'd get reminders of how much of a big deal they are, he sets out to get revenge by making a discount version of their show, but it halfway backfires on him as he got what he wanted but got kicked out anyway. He'd be shown in several more episodes. One where he goes through a bunch of trials by a leprechaun for a head of hair, and being taken in by Commander Hoek and Stimpy and mistook them for his sheep. His intro episode made him look egotistical, but he shouldn't have lost his house. That and his other episodes were okay. Reverend Jack Cheese is a traveling meat salesman who gives insane sermons during the puppet shows he, Ren and Stimpy, put on. The idea for this character came from a moment during a party. While John and Bob Jakes were drunk, he went on a nonsensical rant as Bob piled meat onto him. This made a lot of people laugh, some so much they threw up on what they loved, and a little while after he was taken off the show, the character in his titular episode only work if you understand the behind-the-scenes story, which must have been more confusing than usual for the kids to see him slowly go mad and not do a show because of it. And Sammy Mantis is a praying mantis modeled after Rat Pack member Sammy Davis Jr., vocal mannerisms and all, who Ren and Stimpy are fans of. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. This show makes references to Golden Age Hollywood like him, Frank Sinatra, and Kirk Douglas. Stimpy ends up tracking down where he lives and witnesses him singing a song to the tune of the Candyman that describes him eating heads, and he has Sammy do just that to him. These folks are fine additions to Ren and Stimpy. Now, just because Nickelodeon was handling it now didn't mean there wasn't any censorship. Time for another round of what was taken out and left in on broadcast and on home video. The following was cut out on the English set, then a list of all the episodes that had those segments reinstated on the German version. A longer version of Stimpy being drugged behind Victor's father's car from No Pants Today is missing on the season 3.5 and the German DVD. Scenes which include Ren dusting off his hands, Stimpy clocking out as the sun rises, and Ren talking on the phone while carelessly cutting footage in Stimpy's cartoon show are missing on both versions of the DVD. The beavers whizzing in the town drinking water and the scenes of Ren pranking Stimpy were cut out in the original broadcast. They were put back in on reruns. The season 3.5 DVD removed it. It also doesn't have Ren loading up the boat and sucking fish chum and Bassmasters. The English DVD cuts out Ren being chewed by a buzzard, the silhouette, and a bit with Wilbur Cobb. It also doesn't have Stimpy using Ren as his golf caddy with clubs in his mouth in Ren's retirement. Dialogue between Stimpy and indifferent Ren before they were electrocuted inside a TV and Ren's bitter half were taken out. The whale vomiting seafood from House of Next Tuesday is missing. Stimpy ripping off Wilbur Cobb's face and imitating him from prehistoric Stimpy was removed. Ren and Stimpy being shown without teeth and having to eat like chickens do with more gravel and farm hands was removed. A scene with a frozen tree and the idiot driving off with a gas pump still in the tank and magical golden singing cheeses was cut. The scene with the claim in A Hard Day's Luck was cut out. The chicken's gross dowry was cut. Waffle Woman saying if Powdered Toast Man has the guts was removed. Egg Yokio is missing an opening pan of the village, the title character driving a car with his kidnappers, and Ren rocking the fridge to get him to go to sleep. The season 4 and 5 DVD removes Ren being carried off to the asylum and several scenes of his daily routines, including a visit from Stimpy and his love child from Ren Needs Help. Feud for Sale is missing Ewalt's grandpa and the elephant launcher's elephant collecting his commission. Ren and Stimpy dirtying up the rooms and bellhops was removed. Stimpy's morning wood turning out to be his chest hair and I Was a Teenage Stimpy was cut from broadcast. Who's Stupid Now doesn't have the intro of Ren on stage setting up the cartoon story. Also missing is dialogue between the producer and Ren at the conveyor belt. On broadcast in both DVD sets, majority of the meat ceremony and the shot of Reverend Jack Cheese's skin hat were missing. Sammy and Me is missing dialogue between Ren and Stimpy in bed over the Manded obsession. That episode was banned from Nickelodeon because of Sammy's screw and eye, but it did air on MTV. A poolside scene was missing from The Last Temptation on the DVD set. It was banned from Nickelodeon for its religious parodies, yet aired on MTV. Now for the episodes that were fully restored on the German set. You guys are lucky. No Pants Today, Bassmasters, Ren's Retirement, Eat My Cookies, Ren's Bitter Half, House of Next Tuesday, Prehistoric Stimpy, Farm Hands, Magical Golden Singing Cheeses, A Hard Day's Luck, I Love Chicken, Powdered Toast Man vs. Waffle Woman, Egg Yokio, Ren Needs Help, Feud for Sale, Bellhops, I Was a Teenage Stimpy, Who's Stupid Now, Sammy and Me, and The Last Temptation. Nick were still bringing over several former members of Spumco when they promised the press and their advertisers that they would air the episodes by a set date. However, the transition ate into more production time than they'd like, as they started 2 months late, and the press asked questions about why they fired John. They couldn't tell them it was because he delivered them late, because they were doing it too. The media branding the people working on Ren and Stimpy traitors and pariahs added to the crew's emotional stress. This would have an effect on them trying to match the quality of the Spumco era. The game studio was a sterilized office building. A stark contrast to the musty old building of Spumco did not help staff morale either. If you guys thought John sounded difficult to deal with, Bob Camp wasn't any better. Back in the Spumco days, he was considered just as, if not more, volatile than him. Examples of this include him flipping out at Mitchell Creedman because he didn't think kids would be able to follow the format the show had, and he would threaten to strangle executives during the first meeting over Ren and Stimpy's content. The writers were too scared to bring him network notes because of his reactions. Camp and the crew tried their damnedest to do the remainder of the show the way John would have wanted. The Riley behavior and the desire to create the best work, drilled into them by John, at Spumco lived on at games. However, without him to guide them, many of the crew found themselves second-guessing their decisions as they wondered how he would approach these cartoons. Bob's position in the studio was so he had more time to be creative, while Nick handled all the business, something they had learned from their experience with John and would become the way they would approach creator-driven cartoons in the future. Camp couldn't direct all of the episodes, so he handed off some of them to anyone who wanted the job. Sometimes these artists would get to do the episodes they wanted. Sometimes they'd be put into one they didn't want to do, but they had to if they wanted to direct more. Jim Gomez hated directing circus midgets, but he had to if he wanted to continue as a director. Sometimes an episode would be put through production without notice to the artists. Nickelodeon had encouraged a creative environment, but the tight schedule got in the way of that. This meant some of the bigger artists there had to spend their free time working on the episodes just to make them quality. The atmosphere at the studio had gotten so toxic that Lynn Naylor, who first left after Stimpy's Big Day but returned for season 3 onward, told others who were interested in working at games to go somewhere else. By 1995, everyone was burnt out and ready for Ren and Stimpy to end so they can move on to bigger and better things. Spumco had started off Ren and Stimpy with some spotty animation that was ironed out by its second season. Its characters had dimension in appearance and in writing, and its humor was provocative and clever. But games brought it down on all fronts, and you could feel the lack of passion when it neared the end. The dimension in the drawing melted off the characters. The humor got worse and more graphic than what Spumco did, and the characters had the heart drained out of them. Though Rugrats and Doug had the privilege of longevity, Ren and Stimpy held great influence on cartoons throughout the 90s and 2000s. Similar to how shows like Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, and Steven Universe did in the 2010s. Plenty of cartoons in the 90s tried to copy its zany visual style and gross-out humor to varying success, and it convinced other Viacom-owned networks, MTV and Comedy Central, to take a chance on edgy adult cartoon creators. This made way for Beavis and Butthead and South Park, both incredibly popular and controversial in their primes, and the latter went on to influence other adult cartoons, for better or worse. After he was fired from the show, John failed to capitalize on the publicity he got from it immediately, instead choosing to turn his attention elsewhere. For those who are wondering if I'll talk about the allegations against him, I'll talk about them after the Adult Party cartoon revival in 2003.